Earlier today, I spoke to David Dollar. He's a senior fellow in the John L. Thornton China Center at the Brookings Institution. He provided his insight on how China was able to lift millions out of poverty during the last 3 decades.
By the World Bank standard, China reduced poverty by about 800 million people, which is quite a remarkable feat. I think it's got 2 factors, one at the more macro level and one at the more micro level. At the macro level, you have to grow very rapidly to get that kind of poverty reduction. You have to create a lot of jobs. China had a process of export-oriented growth, brought in a lot of foreign investment and private investment in manufacturing, and that brought literally hundreds of millions of people out of the countryside to the cities, and they immediately had a better life, and they sent some money back home, and they took some of the pressure off the land. So the macro growth phenomenon is important. But then, of course, if a household, if they don't have assets, if they don't have some basic education or some land, access to market, they're not going to be able to benefit. So you need the micro interventions at the community level. China's done a nice job with rural education and rural infrastructure, technical assistance to farmers. So I think it's that combination of giving the poor, who were mostly rural people to start with, giving them various assets and tools, and then generating growth of the macroeconomy.
You mentioned the rural people. That's still an aim. The country hopes to eliminate rural poverty by 2020. How do you think China can meet that target, and how will it finance the endeavor?
So I think as you make progress with poverty reduction, it gets harder and harder. So of those 2 factors I mentioned, increasingly the micro interventions become more important, because China is now a moderately wealthy country, but there's still some people who are really left out, and they tend to be in very isolated areas, or they may be handicapped. They have some kind of special problem. So you really need targeted interventions, minimum income support. It was great that China spread the rural health care program under Premier Wen Jiabao. So things that really get to the individual poor households and enable them to make some living or get some support from the government. That's really the key to receiving, to getting that last few percentage points of the population above the poverty line.
David, I'd like you to dig just a little bit deeper, talk about some specific locations. Talk to us about the success in Lanzhou County. I mean, this is, in 2014, President Xi Jinping visited the county twice to call attention to poverty-stricken areas. They've sort of turned it around, haven't they?
Yeah, so Lanzhou is a great example of this importance of macro and micro, because you had some government programs there. They introduced the growth of a particular kind of tree that flourishes in the climate there. Lanzhou's in Henan province, it's hilly. There's a kind of tree that flourishes there that's really good for making musical instruments. So the government had a good program of technical assistance developing this kind of farming, and farmers had a little bit of land, and they were able to develop this. But then the macro side is important, because you've got this growing wealthy middle class in China having their children learn musical instruments, and so you get a rising demand for violins and different types of musical instruments, and that pushes up the price of the wood, and so the village is ready to meet that demand. And they are one of the villages in the last few years which went from being an official poverty village to not being a poverty village anymore, because enough people were pulled out of poverty.
David Dollar talking about poverty and its prevention.